Hello, welcome to the LPL Brief. Effectively, because we are currently unable to record reactionary play, and there was supposed to be a China Talk episode this week, but I kind of messed up the sound on the recording with Andy Del Rey, so sorry about that, Andy. But when we did do the China Talk, we kind of covered 4 or 5 major teams and discussed some of the detailed aspects of it that I haven't really covered in other mediums or elsewhere, so I thought that it would be a good idea to maybe do 5 short videos on these teams and go into that in detail from what was said in the video with Andy. So naturally, the first team we talked about was the QG Reapers, who are currently on a tear in the LPL. They're completely undefeated. They haven't dropped a game versus Royal Never Give Up, who's dropped 1 game. So they stand out a little bit in that regard. And they're also in a group that I thought might be a little bit more difficult because of Snake and LGD. Of course, LGD completely collapsed. We'll get into that later. And Snake hasn't been looking that great, so that's not necessarily the case. But right now, QG looking very dominant, very strong form. So I wanted to cover that a little bit. And Andy had asked a few really interesting questions. So first of all, the question is, do QG Reapers actually look better than they did last year? The answer is yes. They have better rotational play, better laning phase. They're able to at least go even and farm. We saw in the recent series against Energy Pacemaker All, and then the series against WE Game 2, where they lapsed a little bit in the laning phase, where the enemy jungler was actually getting a lot of kills, but even when you watch that, their laners were strong enough that they could fight back, that they could keep even or overcome the enemy team in farm. And this is both the top lane and the bottom lane, which in the past haven't done that great in farm scores in particular. Map is opening up more, Doing B is getting ahead, so they're still making a lot of these early game mistakes, but you can kind of see this idea that they're competing a little bit better. And I think the thing that makes them look better in this context is just the way that they're approaching strategy a little bit better, the way they're rotating between lanes a little bit better. They've actually come in with some creative compositions that suggest that they understand draft and what's good right now and what suits their style. One thing that I noticed that was really interesting is their approach to lane swapping when they draft Nautilus and Misfortune, is that they will put Nautilus in the 2v1, because right now in the metagame there's kind of this awkward moment where the top laner doesn't really benefit from jungle follow, but there isn't really enough minions built up by the duo lane for him to go and join in the 3v0 push until the second or third wave. So the problem, of course, is that the top laner kind of jungle follows for a little bit and then walks off, but you have to get the timing of that right. With Nautilus, because he has the AoE clear ability that goes out and ripples around him, he's able to clear waves and hold a 2v1 very well. So this is something that the LPL teams have experimented with a little bit, whereas if there's a 2v1, instead of sending the top laner for the awkward jungle follow, you can actually put him in the lane. The benefit then is if you have your top laner holding the lane and you have the enemy duo lane up with the top laner, at the bottom you can have your own duo lane and the enemy top laner, and then you can either get that tower for free while Nautilus actually holds your tower for you, or what they like to do is they have MF, who I think is probably the only AD carry who really benefits from getting an early level 6, so because her kit is so much about the ultimate, and you can have your support roam, or in some cases you can even send your support up top to help Nautilus hold the lane, to help him push and hold the lane. To do this, and this is something that QG haven't executed consistently when they run this composition, is you need to take your Misfortune and rotate him mid lane as soon as he hits 6, so that he can help push out that wave and get that middle tower. Emily Rand recently did this article about the North American teams and the push mid, don't ask why, because effectively both towers on either side go down, and then the team rotates mid and takes mid. So this allows you to go for this objective pretty early, because you can just use your ults to create a threat zone and bully, and maybe even cause problems for the mid laner at that point. Or you can just stay in lane and use your ult and the duo lane to bully the enemy top laner, because he's probably not going to be doing as well as yours. Or pressure your duo to come bot and give the free turret top there. It's a really interesting idea. But I think right now it should only really work if you have a Nautilus or a Misfortune composition. There might be some other ways to do it. But anyway, the point of all that rant is that QG are experimenting their doing something creative that I think is really interesting, which is something that we didn't necessarily see them do with early game or macro style or think about the early game very much. They just sort of winged everything. The other thing that's really interesting is riffing off kind of the idea of the roaming support in the top laner. Moore's laning isn't that great. He tends to go a little bit forward and he gets chunked down really easily in a 2v2 situation, so I don't think he's a great laner. Pekka will do well in a 1v2, and he's better and land by himself when Moore roams more often. And I also think right now the synergy between your top laner and your support is really, really strong. So kind of like support and jungle was really strong last year, I think top and support synergy is really powerful just because you have the teleport calls usually revolve between the support and the top laner, and the support can actually, and the top can actually roam mid, which has been happening a lot more in LPL 2, where the top might push out and then the support will go mid and they'll both gank mid, just in a kind of pincer maneuver with the jungler. And this is something that we saw in the QG game against LGD. The brief memory, you kind of remember Swift was camping top, Marin died a lot. That's just the brief overview of the game. If you remember the first game against LGD and QG, that's probably what you remember. What really happened was Swift went and ganked Marin. Marin burned a flash, right? And then Swift started camping mid really, really hard for like 8.5 minutes until he got a kill. There wasn't really a lot of Swift camping top. What happened was Moore went top and mid quite a bit. I think we're seeing Moore roam around the map a lot more, and this is much more suiting to his style than staying in lane because he's really, really not a good laner. This is something else that allows them to unlock V, who is always someone that they couldn't really maximize the benefit of. He sort of needs pressure to help him get ahead. And to unlock Moore, who they've been landing with and is really, really just a terrible laner. So these are some aspects of QG that I think are helping them do better in the early game and just do better overall in terms of their map pressure and style. So yes, I think they have improved. I think we still are seeing some signs of them not being the best early game team and doing much better in the team fights, as always. But I think that you can look at these points where they've shown strategic advancement, strategic development, and just some stylistic changes and decide that yes, QG as a roster have gotten better. Do you think that QG has a higher ceiling? So this is a really, really difficult question because before, when we've talked about QG on China Talk or what have you, we've always sort of said that QG have a pretty set ceiling. They're never going to be a lane dominant team, all this sort of thing. Last year, when we looked at QG, they started out really, really strong in the summer split LPL, and they actually had dominant early game performances for the first 3 weeks, but then they started to stagnate and their laning got worse and worse. What happened is I think QG's greatest strength is just their teamwork and how they work together and move in this regards. You had Swift being more proactive at that time also, and it just kind of stopped being as strong. And part of this is because I think other LPL teams with roster changes started to adapt a little bit more, started to react to QG's pressure, and they lost some of that edge or got confused or got complacent. They really, really need to resist that and keep sort of doing these changes in early macro game to maintain what they're close to hitting as a ceiling, because I actually think that they're very team play based, and it's not that their players are just super strong, but that they complement each other well. So I don't really necessarily think QG have a higher ceiling, it's just that we're seeing them hit it more right now. This thing though with QG is you still have Dade and UZI looming in the background, and this is something that I actually wrote a complete article about, so I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but the idea that Dade and UZI should see play doesn't make any sense for Dade in particular, okay? I'm just going to address them separately. Dade last year was really, really underwhelming. He probably made an impression in 1 of 10 games, and this is being generous. So Doinby isn't a stellar carry mid laner, kind of like Dade is, but he is a really, really strong complement to Swift, and the two of them work together well as a duo. Dade's advantages are in teamfighting, kind of like what QG already do, and they're already probably the best teamfighting team in the LPL, so I don't really think that adding Dade is going to tip them over the edge. Maybe it'll make their teamfighting just that stronger, but what they really need help with is fixing these early game flaws, and Dade's laning is notoriously not that great. There's always that joke when Spirit and Cloud Templar were casting together where Cloud Templar asks, like, how is Dade? And Spirit says, well, he's really good at team fighting. And Cloud Templar asks, but how is his laning? And Spirit just responds, well, he's really, really good at team fighting. So his laning is kind of non-existent. And in scrims, he's notoriously not done well. So I think if they're going to rotate Dade into scrims and he's not showing motivation in scrims, we'll just never see him play. He actually, I think, played in the reserve league. UZI didn't, and QG dropped 0-2 to OMG's reserve team in the reserve league with Dade. So he's still not necessarily showing signs that he cares that much. When Masters 3 brought him over, I think they didn't really care if he fit into the team. He just sort of was a big name, so they picked him up and it didn't work out. I think people undersell what Condi did for that team, which is that he tried to get Looper and Dade ahead. In the early game, he had like 86% kill participation for over the period of 7 weeks before M3 started to drop off, and he really, really controlled the early game for that team, which was otherwise non-existent. And now Dade is just Dade. I mean, when people say that he carried Masters 3, I don't think they necessarily watched how those games unfolded, because I don't think that's true at all. To say that I don't think we'll see Dade rotate into the roster, strictly speaking. What I do think needs to happen is that they can form a new jungle mid core with Tom and Dade as a duo that has a certain sense of synergy. Pidgey, one of the Chinese esports journalists, kind of hinted that this a little bit, maybe, or maybe I'm just like adding intent to his words that wasn't really there when he said Dade Tom cooperation. I can kind of see them trying to develop a Tom Dade unit the way that Doinby and Swift have developed, not obviously in a different style. But the way Doinby and Swift has developed, I don't see Dade being the type of person to just dive in when Swift does dumb stuff and bail him out the way that Doinby and Swift work together. So I don't think you should remove Doinby and keep Swift, or remove Swift and keep Doinby. I don't think that that's a good idea. UZI is a very, very different story. UZI had a great performance. He has a better early game than Peko. The difference is that when we talk about these types of strategies where Peko is self-sufficient, you obviously can't put in UZI for the same purpose. That will completely change the dynamic. It'll be a very, very bot gank-focused team. He'll probably need a new support that's more lane-oriented to complement UZI's style. So again, I think that the solution here is to try to go for like almost a sister team style setup, where you build an entirely new team around UZI. Maybe you use Dade and Tom, and then you train those two teams together and you play them in scrims, and whichever team does better is the team that gets to play the important LPL matches. I think that's the way that it needs to happen. I don't think you can take parts away from this team whose main strength is teamwork and have it be super successful. Even if UZI is a better player than Peko, even if Dade is a better player than Doinby, I don't think it makes sense right now for them, especially when they're being successful. If they start to look bad, then maybe we can talk about it later, but I still think the best solution isn't going to necessarily be rotating in a new player unless people start to infight and things like this, because UZI, though he's been a shot caller in the past, his strength isn't like his early macro creativity, right? His strength is going ham in lane, pulling the jungler down, which his jungler and the enemy jungler. So there are some benefits that you can see from UZI. I think that Dade and UZI could weirdly complement each other if Dade would play it better like he did in 2014, because Dade has the late game team fighting, UZI has the laning phase. They can work off of each other like this. Like Dade can do really, really good team fighting setups where UZI can just do whatever he wants, including dive 5 people. Something to explore that I'd like to potentially see. I don't really want to see UZI rotating into the main lineup in important games and potentially disrupting the really, really good synergy that QG have going for them right now. Anyway, this is just a brief overview of what's going on with QG right now. If you haven't watched their games, I recommend checking them out. I think their set with EPA was really interesting because EPA played some creative early game stuff. They had a really, really nice Wombo comp with the Zillion and the Misfortune and a few other things that was really creative. So it made the game interesting to watch, and of course QG's team fighting is always really, really strong. Hello, welcome to the LPL Brief. Effectively because we are currently unable to record reactionary play, and there was supposed to be a China Talk episode this week, but I kind of messed up the sound on the recording with Andy Del Rey, so sorry about that, Andy. But when we did do the China Talk, we kind of covered 4 or 5 major teams and discussed defeated. They haven't dropped a game versus Royal Never Give Up, who's dropped 1 game. So they stand out a little bit in that regard. And they're also in a group that I thought might be a little bit more difficult because of Snake and LGD. Of course, LGD completely collapsed. We'll get into that later. And Snake hasn't been looking that great, so that's not necessarily the case. But right now, QG looking very dominant, very strong form. Pacemaker all, and then the series against WE Game 2, where they lapsed a little bit in the laning phase, where the enemy jungler was actually getting a lot of kills, but even when you watch that, their laners were strong enough that they could fight back, that they could keep even or overcome the enemy team in farm. And this is both the top lane and the bottom lane, which in the past haven't done some of the detailed aspects of it that I haven't really covered in other mediums or elsewhere. So I thought that it would be a good idea to maybe do 5 short videos on these teams and go into that in detail from what was said in the video with Andy. So naturally, the first team we talked about was the QG Reapers, who are currently on a tear in the LPL. They're completely so I wanted to cover that a little bit. And Andy had asked a few really interesting questions. So first of all, the question is, do QG Reapers actually look better than they did last year? The answer is yes. They have better rotational play, better laning phase. They're able to at least go even and farm. We saw in the recent series against Energy